23,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, October 24, 1944. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell squinted through the bulletproof glass of his F6F Hellcat, scanning the horizon where a thin layer of cumulus clouds drifted like cotton across the tropical sky. Below him, the greatest naval battle in history was beginning to unfold. Ahead, barely visible through the haze, a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft crawled toward the American carrier task force. 60 enemy planes, 2 Hellcats. The mathematics were impossible. The mission was suicide. McCampbell pushed the throttle forward anyway. What happened in the next 90 minutes would demonstrate something American fighter pilots had learned through blood and practice over the previous year. Something the Japanese High Command had failed to understand. The Pacific War had changed. The aerial tactics that once made Japanese pilots masters of the sky had become their death sentence. And the weapon that delivered that sentence was not just the rugged Grumman fighter McCampbell flew, but a tactical doctrine so devastatingly effective that it turned the Zero from predator to prey. The clouds would hide the hunters. Altitude would provide the energy. Speed would deliver the killing blow. And Japanese pilots, trained for dogfights they would never get, would die before they understood what hit them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of how American pilots learned to dive through clouds and bounce Zeros before they saw them begins not with tactical innovation, but with tactical desperation. In the spring of 1942, American fighter pilots were dying in alarming numbers. The aircraft they flew, the Grumman F6F Wildcat, was a solid machine, armoured, well-armed, able to absorb tremendous punishment. But against the Mitsubishi A6M0, it was fatally outmatched in the areas that mattered most in aerial combat. The Zero turned tighter, climbed faster, operated at longer ranges than American strategists had believed possible. Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns in China, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies, possessed years of combat experience. They flew with confidence bordering on arrogance, secure in the knowledge that their aircraft could outmaneuver anything the Americans could field. The official American tactical doctrine when encountering Zeros was simple and humiliating. Avoid engagement, do not dogfight, run away if possible. This was not cowardice. It was mathematics written in blood. American pilots who tried to turn with Zeros died. The aircraft's lightweight construction and powerful engine gave it a turning radius that no American fighter could match. In a twisting, turning dogfight at low altitude, the Zero was supreme. American losses mounted. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, Wildcat pilots fought bravely but took heavy casualties. At the Battle of Midway in June, torpedo bomber squadrons were slaughtered when their fighter escorts proved unable to prevent Zero attacks. Something had to change. The change began with intelligence. On July 10, 1942, an American patrol plane discovered an intact Zero fighter in an Alaskan marsh. The aircraft, flown by Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga, had crash-landed on Akutan Island after sustaining damage during a raid on Dutch Harbour. Koga died in the crash, but his aircraft, nearly intact and remarkably well preserved by the cold Alaskan climate, provided American engineers with their first opportunity to study the enemy fighter in detail. What they discovered shocked them. The Zero had no armour protection around the cockpit, no self-sealing fuel tanks, no armoured glass in the windscreen. The airframe was constructed of surprisingly thin aluminum alloy. Every design choice prioritized performance over protection. The aircraft was fast because it was light. It was maneuverable because it carried no protective weight. It was deadly because Japanese designers had made a calculated bet that offense mattered more than defense. The captured Zero was shipped to Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego, where Navy test pilots wrung out every aspect of its performance. Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders flew the aircraft through exhaustive trials, probing for weaknesses. He found several critical vulnerabilities. The Zero's engine used a float-type carburetor that cut out under negative G forces, pushed the nose down hard, and the engine quit. The Zero's ailerons stiffened dramatically at high speeds, making it difficult to roll in high-speed combat. The aircraft's never-exceed speed was dangerously low. Dive too fast, and the Zero risked structural failure. The controls became mushy above 350 miles per hour. Most importantly, the test flights revealed that the Zero's legendary maneuverability came with a price. To achieve its incredible turning ability, Japanese designers had sacrificed speed and structural strength. The aircraft simply could not compete with American fighters in diving attacks or high-speed combat. This intelligence arrived at precisely the moment when American aircraft designers were finalizing specifications for a new carrier fighter. The Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation had been working on a Wildcat replacement since 1941. The design that emerged, designated XF6F1, incorporated lessons learned from early Pacific combat and from the captured Zero. The prototype first flew on June 26, 1942, just 16 days after the Battle of Midway. The timing was providential. Engineers at Grumman and the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics studied the Akutan Zero test results and made critical decisions about the new fighter's design philosophy. They chose protection over pure performance. The F6F Hellcat would carry 200 pounds of armor plating around the cockpit. It would have self-sealing fuel tanks that swelled shut when punctured. It would have bulletproof glass in the windscreen. It would be built rugged, able to absorb battle damage and bring pilots home. These design choices added weight. Lots of weight. The Hellcat, at 10,080 pounds empty, was the heaviest single-engine fighter in American service. Critics within the Navy called it a flying truck, but weight brought advantages that would prove decisive. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, gave it a top speed of 380 miles per hour at 19,000 feet. Not as fast as some contemporaries, but fast enough. More importantly, the engine's power and the aircraft's weight gave it superior diving characteristics. The Hellcat could dive faster than a Zero and pull out without risking structural failure. In a vertical fight, energy versus maneuverability, the Hellcat held every advantage. The aircraft entered production in October of 1942. By March of 1943, the first F6 F3 Hellcats were aboard the USS Essex. By September, they were in combat. The first major engagement came on October 5th and 6th, 1943, during strikes against Wake Island. 47 Hellcats launched before dawn, flying through darkness toward the Japanese-held atoll. 50 miles out, Japanese radar detected them. 27 Zeros scrambled to intercept. What happened next would establish the pattern for every Hellcat Zero engagement for the rest of the war. The American pilots, led by experienced commanders who had studied the Akutan Zero tests, refused to dogfight. When Zeros dove to attack, Hellcat pilots rolled into high-speed dives, using their superior diving speed to break contact. When Zeros tried to escape by climbing, Hellcat pilots pursued, using their excellent high altitude performance to close the distance. When opportunities presented themselves, Hellcat pilots made quick, slashing attacks, firing short bursts from their 650 caliber machine guns before diving away. The Zeros, flown by pilots trained for turning combat, could not adapt. They tried to force the Americans into the low speed, turning fights where Zero performance was superior. But the Hellcats refused to cooperate. They fought in the vertical plane, trading altitude for speed and speed for altitude in a continuous cycle that the lighter Zeros could not match. By day's end, the Americans claimed 30 Japanese aircraft destroyed for the loss of only a handful of Hellcats. The tactical doctrine was sound. Speed and altitude defeated maneuverability. Boom and zoom tactics defeated turning combat. But something else was emerging in American tactical thinking. Something that would transform the Hellcat from merely superior to absolutely dominant. The lesson came from studying how the most successful pilots operated. Men like Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare, who had developed night fighting tactics before his death in November of 1943. Pilots like Commander John Thach, whose Thach-Weave defensive formation had saved countless lives in the dark days of 1942. These pioneers understood something fundamental about aerial combat. The side that saw the enemy first usually won. The side that attacked from surprise usually survived. Altitude provided the energy for attack, but clouds provided the concealment that made surprise possible. By late 1943, experienced Hellcat pilots were developing a tactical approach that combined altitude advantage with weather exploitation. They would climb high, above 20,000 feet, where the Hellcat's supercharged engine breathed efficiently and the Zero's performance began to fall off. They would position themselves between the sun and the enemy, using the blinding glare to mask their presence. And when cumulus clouds were present, they would hide in the white billows, emerging only when positioned perfectly above and behind enemy formations. The tactic required nerve. Flying blind through clouds at high speed risked mid-air collision with wingmen. Emerging from clouds required split-second orientation and target acquisition. But for pilots who mastered the technique, the results were devastating. A Zero pilot scanning the sky ahead, above, and to the sides might never look straight up through the clouds above him. A formation of Japanese bombers, concentrating on navigation and formation flying, would have no warning when Hellcats plunged vertically through the clouds, guns hammering, before diving away into another cloud bank below. The Japanese called these attacks Tenrai, the thunderbolt from heaven. There was no defense. By the time you saw the Hellcat, you were already dead. The tactical innovation spread through the carrier air groups during the winter of 1943 and spring of 1944. Training squadrons in Hawaii practiced cloud diving until it became second nature. Fighter directors on the carriers learned to position combat air patrols high, always climbing, always seeking the altitude advantage. Radar operators learned to guide Hellcat divisions toward incoming Japanese raids, calling out altitudes and headings that positioned the American fighters above and behind the enemy. The technology to make this tactic truly lethal emerged in early 1944. Radar-equipped Hellcat night fighters, the F6F3 Newtons and later the F6F5 Newtons models, carried AN/APS-6 radar in a bulbous pod on the starboard wing. The radar had a range of 5 miles and could detect aircraft altitude. More importantly, it worked through clouds. A Hellcat pilot could hide in cloud cover, use his radar to locate enemy aircraft below, and set up a perfect attack run without ever being seen. Initially, only dedicated night fighter squadrons flew these radar-equipped variants. But by mid-1944, the tactical applications for daylight combat were obvious. Even without radar, regular Hellcat pilots learned to use clouds tactically. The key was patience and discipline. Resist the temptation to attack immediately. Climb high. Use the clouds. Wait for the perfect setup. Then strike with overwhelming violence and speed. The transformation in American fighter effectiveness was dramatic. In the 6 months after Wake Island, Hellcat squadrons compiled increasingly lopsided kill ratios. During strikes on Rabaul in November of 1943, Hellcat pilots achieved 30 aerial victories for the loss of 1 aircraft. At Tarawa, later that same month, 12 Hellcats destroyed 17 Zeros without loss. On November 24th, over Tarawa, Ensign Ralph Hanks became the first Hellcat pilot to achieve ace status, shooting down 5 Zeros in a single mission. The technique he used became standard. Position above the enemy formation, hide in the sun or clouds if available, wait until perfectly positioned, dive at high speed, firing only when close enough to guarantee hits. Break away before the enemy can react, climb back to altitude and repeat. The Japanese had no effective counter. Their training emphasized individual combat skills and aerobatic maneuvers. They practiced victory rolls and tight turns and fancy flying. But they did not train for energy management. They did not emphasize maintaining altitude advantage. They did not teach pilots to refuse unfavorable combat and run away to reset. Japanese tactical doctrine, developed in the era when the Zero dominated, assumed that maneuverability and pilot skill would win dogfights. It worked brilliantly in 1941 and early 1942, when Japanese pilots were veterans and American pilots were novices. But by late 1943, the situation had reversed. American pilots, rotated through combat tours and then sent back to train new squadrons, accumulated experience and passed it forward. The training pipeline produced pilots with 300 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. Japanese pilots, kept at the front until they died or were evacuated wounded, died in alarming numbers. The replacements had minimal training, sometimes less than 100 hours total flight time. They launched on their first combat missions barely able to fly their aircraft competently, let alone fight effectively. Fuel shortages meant training flights were cut. Experienced instructors were sent to combat units where they were lost. The quality gap widened with every passing month. By the spring of 1944, American fighter pilots enjoyed not just superior aircraft, but superior training, superior tactics, superior numbers, and increasingly, superior experience. The only thing preventing complete American aerial dominance was the sheer size of the Pacific theater. There were simply too many Japanese bases, too many islands, too many aircraft scattered across thousands of miles of ocean. That was about to change. On June 19, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy attempted a decisive carrier battle in the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers with 450 aircraft. He faced Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58, 15 carriers with 956 aircraft. The numbers alone told the story. But numbers did not convey the qualitative gap that had opened. The Japanese carrier air groups were filled with barely trained pilots flying obsolete aircraft according to outdated tactical doctrine. The American carrier air groups were filled with combat veterans flying superior aircraft according to doctrine refined through 2 years of hard fighting. Mitcher's fighter directors, using advanced radar, detected the Japanese strike packages while they were still over 100 miles away. The directors launched massive combat air patrols, stacking Hellcats at multiple altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet. The Japanese attacks came in waves. The first wave, launched at 08:30 hours, consisted of 69 aircraft, mostly Zeros and Judy dive bombers. They flew directly toward the American fleet, maintaining formation, concentrating on navigation, unaware they were being tracked by radar every mile of the way. Hellcat divisions, positioned high and waiting, watched the Japanese formations pass below them. Then, on command from the fighter directors, they dove. The Japanese pilots never saw them coming. The Hellcats plunged from above, diving through layers of thin cloud, emerging with tremendous speed advantage. The 650 caliber machine guns in each Hellcat wing hammered for 2-second bursts. Each burst fired 65 rounds. 12 guns per 2-plane section meant 130 rounds converging on target. The lightly built Japanese aircraft disintegrated. Zeros exploded into fireballs as bullets ruptured their non-self-sealing fuel tanks. Judy dive bombers tumbled from the sky, wings ripped off by the concentrated fire. Some Japanese pilots tried to turn and fight. But turning bled energy they could not recover quickly enough. The Hellcats dove past, pulled up, climbed back to altitude using their superior power-to-weight ratio in the climb, and attacked again. The few Japanese aircraft that survived the initial interception pressed on toward the American carriers. They faced additional layers of Hellcats, then anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers, then massed fire from the carriers themselves. Of the 69 aircraft in the first wave, only 27 returned to their carriers, and those survivors returned with tales that terrified the pilots in the ready rooms. The Americans were everywhere. They dove from above, they appeared from clouds, they could not be shaken, they could not be outmaneuvered. Fighting them was suicide. The second wave launched at 0900 hours, 130 aircraft. The result was the same. Hellcats, directed by radar, positioned high, dove through the Japanese formations like wolves through sheep. The kill ratio was devastating. American pilots, finding targets everywhere, forgot normal fire discipline and simply shot at everything that moved. Lieutenant Alex Vraciu of VF-16 shot down 6 Judy dive bombers in 8 minutes. Ensign Wilbur Spider Webb shot down 6 aircraft and damaged 3 more. Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15, shot down 4 aircraft and damaged several others. The pattern repeated across the battle space. Hellcats dove, killed, climbed, and dove again. The Japanese formations disintegrated. Some pilots jettisoned their bombs and fled. Others pressed on, only to be shot down. Of the 130 aircraft in the second wave, 97 were destroyed. The third and fourth waves suffered similar losses. By day's end, the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air groups had effectively ceased to exist. Of the 450 aircraft that began the day operational, 315 were destroyed in aerial combat or crashed attempting to land on Guam. The Americans lost 23 aircraft to enemy action, 23 out of 956. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was immediately dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by American pilots. The name stuck. It perfectly captured the one-sided nature of the engagement. But beneath the celebratory tone lay a deeper truth. The Turkey Shoot was not the result of American superiority alone. It was the result of Japanese collapse. The experienced pilots who had terrorized the Pacific in 1941 and 42 were dead. Their replacements, rushed through truncated training programs with insufficient fuel and inadequate instruction, were lambs sent to slaughter. The tactical doctrine that had worked brilliantly with expert pilots in maneuverable aircraft became a death trap when flown by novices against opponents who refused to fight on Japanese terms. The cloud diving tactic, the altitude advantage, the boom and zoom attacks, all of these worked because Japanese pilots could not adapt. They were trained to dogfight. They believed maneuverability would save them. They turned when they should have run. They climbed when they should have dove. They fought individually when they should have maintained formation discipline. Every instinct, every habit, every tactical principle they had learned was wrong for the new reality of Pacific air combat. And they died learning that lesson, over and over, until there was no one left to learn. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The lesson of the Marianas Turkey Shoot spread quickly through American fighter squadrons. Altitude wins, speed kills, clouds hide. Discipline matters more than bravery. These principles would guide American fighter tactics for the remainder of the war. But the ultimate test of the cloud diving doctrine came 4 months later, in the skies above the Philippines, October 24, 1944. The same day our story began, with Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell climbing through 23,000 feet, scanning for the enemy formation his radar had detected. McCampbell was not an average pilot. At 34 years old, he was older than most carrier pilots. He had graduated from the Naval Academy in 1933, served on cruisers, then transitioned to aviation. By 1944, he was Commander Air Group 15, aboard the USS Essex. He had already shot down 21 aircraft, making him a double ace. He understood energy fighting better than almost anyone in the Navy. He knew how to use altitude. He knew how to use speed. And he knew how to be patient. His wingman that morning was Ensign Roy Rushing, younger and less experienced, but well-trained and steady. Rushing would follow McCampbell's lead, covering his 6, while the more experienced pilot picked targets. They had launched at 0700 hours for a routine combat air patrol, but intelligence had warned that a major Japanese strike was inbound, the largest concentration of enemy aircraft seen in months, potentially over 100 planes heading toward the American Carrier Task Force. McCampbell and Rushing were supposed to be part of a larger fighter sweep, but the other Hellcats had mechanical problems or were delayed. Just 2 Hellcats, just McCampbell and Rushing, against what turned out to be 60 enemy aircraft. The smart move was to stay high, report the contact, and wait for reinforcements. But the Japanese bombers were heading directly toward Essex. McCampbell's ship, his squadron, his responsibility. He checked his fuel gauge, half full. His main tank had failed to fill properly during the rushed launch. He had perhaps 90 minutes of fuel. Enough for one extended fight, if he was careful. If he was lucky. He keyed his radio and spoke to Rushing. Simple. calm, professional. "We're going in. Stay with me." McCampbell had every advantage except numbers. He had altitude. The Japanese formation was cruising at 15,000 feet, 8,000 feet below him. He had position. The enemy was flying straight and level, maintaining formation, all attention focused forward on navigation and the distant American fleet. He had surprise. The Japanese pilots, scanning ahead for American fighters, did not look up. They did not expect attack from above and behind. They certainly did not expect just 2 aircraft to attack 60. McCampbell had experience. 2 years of combat flying, hundreds of hours in the Hellcat, intimate knowledge of its capabilities and limitations. He had studied the after-action, reports from the Marianas Turkey shoot. He knew what worked: dive fast, shoot straight, kill quickly, break away clean, climb back up, repeat. There was one more advantage, subtle but critical. Scattered clouds dotted the sky at multiple altitudes. Not solid overcast, but enough cumulus build-ups to provide concealment if used correctly. McCampbell positioned his 2-plane section to approach the Japanese formation from the stern, slightly offset to one side, with the sun behind him and a large cumulus cloud to his right. If the Japanese spotted him during the initial dive, he could break right into the cloud, disappear, and reset. If the first attack went well, he could use the clouds to mask his subsequent attacks, popping out at unpredictable angles and altitudes. The Japanese would never know where the next attack was coming from. It was 3-dimensional chess played at 400 miles per hour, where mistakes meant death and perfect execution meant survival. McCampbell nosed over into a shallow dive, building speed gradually, keeping his energy under control. Rushing tucked in tight, matching every move. They accelerated through 300 miles per hour. 320, 340. The Japanese formation grew larger in McCampbell's reflector gun sight. He could see the distinct profiles now. Mitsubishi A6M0's riding escort. Nakajima Ki 43 Oscar fighters mixed in. In the center of the formation, the bombers. Probably Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, heading for the American carriers. Not tight combat spread, but standard cruise formation, aircraft spread out for ease of station keeping. That was good. It meant they were not expecting combat. It meant they were relaxed, complacent, vulnerable. McCampbell picked his first target carefully. A 0 on the right side of the formation, slightly above the others, possibly the section leader. Kill him first. The rest of the section would lose coordination. He steadied his aim, closing the range, waiting for the perfect shot. Fighter pilot instinct said, shoot early, shoot often. But McCampbell knew better. Ammunition was limited. He had 2,400 rounds for his 6 guns. That sounded like a lot, but at 400 rounds per minute per gun, it was only 36 seconds of continuous fire. And he needed to make this fuel and these bullets last as long as possible. He held his fire until he was within 300 yards, close enough to see the individual panel lines on the Zero's fuselage, close enough to see the red Hinomaru rising sun on the wings, close enough to be certain. Then he pressed the trigger. The 650 caliber machine guns hammered. The Hellcat shuddered slightly as 65 rounds punched out in a 2-second burst. Tracers arced across the gap, converging on the Zero's engine, cowling and cockpit. The Zero staggered. Smoke streamed from the engine. The canopy shattered. The aircraft rolled left and dove away, trailing flame. McCampbell did not watch it fall. He was already transitioning to his next target, another Zero 50 yards ahead of the first. Another 2-second burst. More hits. The Zero's wing root erupted in flame as bullets ruptured the non-self-sealing fuel tank. The aircraft broke apart in mid-air. Still, the main formation had not reacted. The attack had taken perhaps 6 seconds. 2 kills. The surviving Japanese pilots were just beginning to realize something was wrong. McCampbell dove past the formation, using his accumulated speed to extend away below them, pulling 3 Gs in a gentle turning climb back to altitude. Rushing stayed glued to his wing, exactly where he was supposed to be. By the time the Japanese formation reacted, broke up, and began maneuvering, McCampbell was 3,000 feet above them again, climbing toward a convenient cloud bank. He disappeared into the white mist, counting slowly, giving the enemy time to lose sight of him, to forget about him, to assume he had departed. Then he rolled out of the cloud on the opposite side, assessed the situation, and dove again. The Japanese formation was scattered now, aircraft milling around, trying to reform, trying to figure out where the Americans had gone. McCampbell picked off a straggler, an Oscar that had separated from the group. One burst. The Oscar rolled inverted and fell, trailing smoke. The pattern continued for the next 90 minutes. Attack, kill, extend, climb, hide in clouds, re-attack. McCampbell worked through the enemy formation methodically, like a butcher at work. He shot down 2 more zeros, then an Oscar, then another zero. Each kill used approximately 200 rounds, about 8 seconds of fire spread across multiple bursts. He was shooting better than he had ever shot before, almost every burst connecting, almost every hit causing critical damage. Rushing, covering McCampbell's 6, shot down his own targets. A zero that tried to follow McCampbell into a cloud, an Oscar that attempted a head-on pass, another zero trying to climb away. The Japanese pilots, trained for turning combat, could not comprehend what was happening. They tried to turn and fight, but the Hellcats refused to engage in turning combat. They tried to climb away, but the Hellcats had superior climb rate at altitude. They tried to dive away, but the Hellcats dove faster. Some Japanese pilots, more experienced or more desperate, tried to attack the American carriers anyway, hoping to complete their mission even as their formation disintegrated. McCampbell chased them down one by one, using altitude he had preserved and fuel he had hoarded, making each shot count, each burst precise and deadly. His gun camera footage, reviewed later aboard Essex, showed textbook deflection shooting. McCampbell was not just a good pilot, he was a master craftsman, demonstrating skills honed over thousands of hours of training and combat. But skill alone did not explain his success. The tactical doctrine explained his success. Altitude, speed, energy management, cloud concealment, patience, discipline. Every principle of boom and zoom tactics, perfected. By 0900 hours, McCampbell's fuel gauge showed empty. The engine coughed. He had perhaps 5 minutes before flameout. He glanced around the sky one last time, looking for Rushing. There, safe, still in formation, they turned for home. Behind them, the scattered remnants of the Japanese formation limped away, their mission failed, their casualties catastrophic. When McCampbell landed aboard Essex, he had shot down 9 aircraft, 7 zeros and 2 Oscars. Rushing had shot down 6, 15 kills between 2 aircraft, the largest single mission score by a 2-plane section in the history of naval aviation. McCampbell had fired 1,800 rounds. 9 kills with 1,800 rounds meant 200 rounds per kill. Exceptional marksmanship by any standard. For this action, McCampbell received the Medal of Honor. The citation praised his courage and skill, but it might have more accurately praised his discipline and tactical sophistication. McCampbell had not won through reckless bravery or aerobatic brilliance. He had won by understanding energy, altitude, speed, and how to use clouds to maintain surprise through multiple attack passes. He had won by refusing to fight on the enemy's terms. He had won by turning the Hellcats' advantages in speed and diving ability into an insurmountable tactical edge. The cloud diving doctrine, used to devastating effect by McCampbell and hundreds of other Hellcat pilots throughout late 1944 and 45, represented the culmination of 3 years of tactical evolution. It combined lessons learned from the captured Akutan Zero, technological advantages built into the Hellcat's design, and operational experience gained through thousands of combat sorties. The doctrine's effectiveness rested on several key principles. First, altitude provided the potential energy that could be converted to speed in a dive. A Hellcat at 25,000 feet could dive to 15,000 feet, converting 10,000 feet of altitude into 200 additional miles per hour of speed. That speed made the Hellcat nearly impossible to intercept during the attack pass and nearly impossible to pursue during the escape. Second, clouds provided tactical concealment that negated the enemy's numerical advantage. A Japanese formation of 40 aircraft could not effectively defend against attacks coming from unpredictable directions at unpredictable times. Cloud diving tactics broke up enemy formations, sowed confusion, and allowed small numbers of Hellcats to achieve disproportionate results. Third, discipline in energy management meant Hellcat pilots could sustain operations for extended periods. By refusing to dogfight, by breaking off attacks before bleeding energy in turns, by always climbing back to altitude before re-engaging, Hellcat pilots preserved the energy state that made them lethal. Japanese pilots, burning energy in defensive maneuvers, could not. Fourth, the 6-month advantage in pilot training gave American pilots the technical skills to execute precision boom and zoom attacks. Flying blind through clouds required instrument flying skills many Japanese pilots lacked. Pulling out of high-speed dives required understanding of energy and G-forces. Shooting accurately during a 2-second firing pass required gunnery training most Japanese pilots never received. The cumulative effect was overwhelming American air superiority throughout the last year of the Pacific War. In the Philippines campaign from October to December of 1944, Hellcat pilots achieved kill ratios exceeding 20-1 in some engagements. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japanese air power attempted to interfere with American carrier operations and failed catastrophically. Hellcats, operating from up to 15 carriers, simultaneously, created an aerial umbrella that Japanese aircraft could not penetrate. When kamikaze attacks began in earnest in late 1944, Hellcats proved effective even against the suicide tactics. Kamikaze aircraft, flying straight and level toward their targets, were easy prey for diving Hellcats that could attack from altitude and break away before the kamikaze pilot could react. Fighter directors, using radar to detect inbound kamikazes, would position Hellcat divisions high and upwind, then vector them onto the targets. The Hellcats would dive through clouds, emerge with perfect position, and destroy the kamikazes before they reached the fleet. It was not perfect. Some kamikazes got through. Some hit carriers, causing terrible casualties. But the percentage that succeeded was far lower than Japanese planners had hoped. Hellcat pilots, using altitude and cloud tactics, shot down hundreds of kamikaze aircraft before they could reach their targets. By the spring of 1945, during operations around Okinawa, Japanese air power had been effectively destroyed. The few remaining Japanese aircraft were flown by pilots with minimal training, operating according to tactical doctrine that had failed completely. They flew into pre-positioned Hellcat divisions, were intercepted 50 or more miles from the American fleet, and were destroyed in overwhelming numbers. On April 17, 1945, 4 Hellcats from USS Yorktown, operating at 25,000 feet, detected a formation of 40 Japanese bombers and fighters approaching the carrier task force. The Hellcat section dove, bounced the Japanese formation from above, and shot down 11 aircraft before the survivors scattered. This engagement, like hundreds of others, demonstrated principles established by McCampbell and refined through constant practice. The numbers tell the story of the Hellcat's dominance. In just over 2 years of combat operations, from September 1943 to August 1945, Hellcat pilots were credited with destroying 5,156 enemy aircraft. This represented approximately 75% of all aerial victories achieved by United States Navy and Marine Corps pilots in the Pacific theater. The Hellcat's kill-to-loss ratio was 19-1. For every Hellcat lost in air-to-air combat, 19 enemy aircraft were destroyed. 305 Hellcat pilots became aces, achieving 5 or more aerial victories. 15 pilots achieved double ace status with 10 or more kills. These statistics were not the result of superior numbers alone, though American industrial production certainly provided numerical advantage. They were the result of a lethal combination of superior aircraft design, superior pilot training, superior tactical doctrine, and superior operational experience. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero in level flight and vastly faster in a dive. The Hellcat was more rugged, able to absorb damage that would destroy a Zero. The Hellcat pilot had more training, more flying hours, and by mid-1944, more combat experience. The Hellcat pilot fought according to tactical doctrine refined through bitter experience, doctrine that exploited every American advantage while negating every Japanese advantage. The cloud diving tactic was the ultimate expression of this doctrine. It combined altitude, energy, speed, surprise, and tactical flexibility into a nearly unbeatable combination. Japanese pilots, trained for a different kind of war, could not adapt. Their tactics, developed in the era when the Zero dominated, assumed maneuverability and pilot skill would win dogfights. These assumptions were correct when Japanese pilots were veterans flying against inexperienced opponents in inferior aircraft, but by late 1944, every assumption was wrong. American pilots were experienced. American aircraft were superior in the pilotstasis, areas that mattered. American tactics exploited those advantages ruthlessly. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots was devastating. Imagine being a young Japanese Navy pilot in late 1944. You have received perhaps 100 hours of flight training, half of what your predecessors received 3 years earlier. You have never flown in combat. You launch on your first mission, part of a formation of 40 aircraft heading toward the American fleet. You are nervous but confident. You have been told the Americans fear the Zero. You have been told your superior maneuverability will prevail. You fly for an hour, maintaining formation, watching the horizon for the American carriers. Then, without warning, Hellcats plunge through the clouds above you. You never saw them, never knew they were there. The aircraft next to you explodes. Another spins away, trailing flame. You try to turn, to engage, to use your maneuverability advantage, but the Hellcats are already gone, diving away at impossible speed. You chase them, but your airspeed drops as you turn. They pull away effortlessly. You return to your heading, trying to reform your scattered formation. Minutes later, the Hellcats attack again, from a different angle, from a different altitude, perhaps from a different cloud. More of your formation dies. You fire your cannon, but the range is too great, the deflection angle impossible. The Hellcats zoom away again, climbing back to altitude. This continues for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, an hour. Your formation shrinks with each attack. The survivors scatter. Some flee. Some press on toward the target. Some try to engage the Hellcats and die. You make it back to your carrier, traumatized, having witnessed half your formation destroyed, having never fired an effective shot. And the worst part is understanding that tomorrow, or the next day, you will launch on another mission, and it will happen again. This was the reality for Japanese naval aviators, from mid-1944 onward. Missions were not combat, they were execution. The only question was whether you would die on this mission or the next. The tactical lessons learned in the Pacific Air War influenced American fighter doctrine for decades. The emphasis on energy tactics, speed over maneuverability, boom and zoom versus turning combat, all became foundational principles for jet-age fighters. The F-86 Sabre pilots who fought in Korea used tactics directly descended from Hellcat doctrine. The F-4 Phantom pilots in Vietnam, though flying an aircraft fundamentally different from the Hellcat, still relied on speed and energy management rather than turning ability. Modern fighter tactics, though transformed by missiles and radar, still respect the principles established by Hellcat pilots over the Philippine Sea. The Hellcat itself passed into history quickly after the war. More advanced designs like the F6F Bearcat offered superior performance. Jets were the future. By 1950, most Hellcats had been retired, converted to drones, or transferred to reserve squadrons. A few served in the Korean War, mostly in ground attack roles. The last operational Hellcats were retired in the mid-1950s, but the aircraft's legacy endured. It had turned the tide of the Pacific Air War. It had established tactics that would guide American fighter doctrine for generations. It had saved thousands of American lives by bringing pilots home from battles they survived because the Hellcat absorbed damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Perhaps most importantly, it had given American pilots the confidence that they could win. After 2 years of defeats and near defeats, after Coral Sea and Midway and Guadalcanal, the Hellcat arrived and proved that American technology, American industry, and American pilots could dominate the sky. The cloud diving doctrine was not inevitable. It emerged from careful study of enemy weaknesses, rigorous exploitation of American advantages, and continuous tactical refinement based on operational experience. It succeeded because Hellcat pilots had the discipline to fight smart rather than fight brave. They climbed high when instinct said engage low. They extended away when pride said stay and fight. They used clouds to hide when honor suggested fair combat. These choices, repeated thousands of times across 2 years of war, broke Japanese air power and secured American victory in the Pacific. On that October morning in 1944, when David McCampbell dove through scattered clouds to attack a formation 60 times larger than his own force, he was not just being brave. He was executing doctrine refined through blood and practice. He was exploiting advantages built into his aircraft and his training. He was demonstrating that in aerial combat, tactics matter more than numbers, discipline matters more than courage, and the side that dictates terms usually wins. The Japanese formation never stood a chance. Not because Japanese pilots were cowards or incompetent, but because they were fighting according to principles that no longer applied. They were trapped in the tactical assumptions of 1941, when the Zero dominated and American pilots fled. They never adapted to the new reality where American fighters owned altitude, speed, and tactical initiative. They died learning that maneuverability without speed is useless, that numbers without coordination accomplish nothing, and that attacking an enemy who sees you first rarely ends well. McCampbell landed aboard Essex with 9 kills, having expended most of his fuel and ammunition, having survived one of the greatest single-mission aerial victories in history. He had used altitude for energy, clouds for concealment, speed for attack and escape, and discipline to sustain operations through multiple engagements. He had demonstrated, in the most dramatic fashion possible, why the Hellcat dominated the Pacific sky, not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable fighter, but because it was fast enough, tough enough, and paired with tactical doctrine sophisticated enough to defeat any opponent. The story of Hellcat pilots diving through clouds to bounce Zeros before they saw them is not a story of technological superiority alone. It is a story of tactical innovation, operational experience, institutional learning, and disciplined execution. It is a story of how an entire service, the United States Navy, studied failure, adapted to new realities, and developed doctrine that turned near defeat into overwhelming victory. It is a story worth remembering, not just as history, but as a demonstration of how tactical excellence can transform material advantage into decisive results. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.